Thank you very much, and thanks very much everyone for coming out tonight. As Emily said, I'm going to do a little reading from the book. I'm going to read a few of the strips and show a handful of images related to the book, and then Tom and I will have a chat. So let's see if we can get the slideshow up on the screen. Sure. So all these cartoons are from Revenge of the Librarians. They're kind of on a book and literature theme. Great. This first one's called Mathematical Problems for Novelists. Susie has written 12 chapters of a novel. Her editor asks her to cut 3 chapters and revise 8 chapters. How many glasses of wine does Susie drink that night? Every day, Paul spends 3 hours procrastinating, 2 hours worrying, and 1 hour napping. How long until the publisher asks Paul to repay his advance? Anne writes a new novel every 6 months. 3/4 of Anne's novels are bestsellers, and 2/3 win prizes. How much do you hate Anne? So these cartoons originally appear in the Guardian newspaper every Saturday in a section called The Review, which is their sort of arts and books section. This is the one time I drew a cover for them, which was about time travel in literature. I've had this sort of space on the books page. You can see it there under an interview with Neil Gaiman. For 17 years now, I've been making one of these strips every week. And these cartoon ideas always start for me with my sketchbooks. That's where I work out my ideas, and I always have a little red book in my pocket and one of the bigger art spirals in my bag, because I'm doing this every week. I'm always hunting for new ideas. So I end up filling pages with little doodles, and it's not so much about the drawings themselves, it's more about the process of making them. It's a kind of way I think, so I'll sit in cafes, or I'll walk around with the little book, or I'll sit at my desk at the studio, and I try and do as much of the work as I can in my sketchbook and really get the idea working before I start making the finished art. And here's a page of the little sketchbook. I picked out these two, I suppose, because they're quite pretty sketchbook pages, but then I realized that none of them yet have turned into any ideas. There's almost a reverse correlation between pretty pages and good ideas, because if the ideas start working, I tend to speed up and things get a little scrappier. I sort of see these sketchbooks almost as a kind of compost that my new ideas can grow out of. So I keep all the books beside my desk, and if I'm stuck, I look through some old books and hopefully find some forgotten piece in there. It's rare I'll find something that works immediately, but I might just see an image that sets me off. And that's me drawing the final art. I make quite careful pencil drawings, reworking them until they're right, and then I use a light box which shines light through, and I can trace them onto paper, and then I color them on the computer. So I'll show a handful of more sketchbook pages as we go, but mainly I'm going to be reading now. This is the cartoon that gave the book its title. The Librarians. We thought the government had beaten them, but they'd only chased them underground. Then one day the librarians came back. With superior organization skills, they quickly seized power. Opponents were mercilessly shushed. Every building was converted into a library. Every wall into bookshelves, every person into a library card holder. A whole world organized on the Dewey Decimal Classification System. We never should have messed with the librarians. Shh. And this one kind of came about because there was our government's been having various cutbacks on libraries, and I wanted to make something kind of supporting in the librarians, but it seemed kind of wimpy to just kind of do a, hey, aren't librarians nice? So I sort of flipped it around and decided to kind of make them the powerful oppressors. And I guess thinking of the opposite of things is often a way of coming up with cartoon ideas. This one's called Some Useful New Words for Readers. Bookend schmerz, encroaching melancholy as you approach the end of a good book. Leichtel Bucheifersucht, envying someone enjoying a light fun book while you struggle through a long worthy one. Stapelschuldgefühl, guilt felt upon buying new books when you have a pile of unread ones at home. Buchverlusterleichterung, relief upon finding that you have lost your copy of a book that you weren't really enjoying anyway. I wanted these to be very silly words, but I did want them to work grammatically in German, so I worked with my friend Frank, who's German, to make sure that they were grammatically possible, even though they're very silly. Often the cartoons are about a silly idea seen seriously through to a kind of even sillier conclusion. Tragic deaths in the badly written novel. Choked on a piece of terrible dialogue. Lost forever down a colossal plot hole. Drowned in a sea of unnecessary details. Died from a fall in a bungled cliffhanger. Crushed by an enormous chunk of exposition. Those were kind of all inspired by one of my illustration heroes, Edward Gorey, who has a very dark sense of humor and has inspired me a lot. And so he inspires all my work, but that one was particularly inspired by him. Judging by the amount of time that she spends staring out the window at us, she's either a very committed ornithologist or a very unfocused writer. That one was done during the pandemic when we were all spending quite a lot of time looking out the window. And that's the sketchbook page where I kind of began to work out the ideas for it. Advice on caring for your books that also works for parenting. Protect from strong sunlight, smoke, dust, and mildew. Take special care not to damage the spine. Put your phone away and give your full attention. Do not let too many pile up on top of one another. Only lend them to reliable friends. The overly complex thriller. Intriguing conversation. Inexplicable death. Puzzling phone call. Disorienting chase. Mystifying documents. Perplexing double cross. Convoluted search. Unfathomable conspiracy. Impenetrable explanation. Bewildering showdown. Baffling ending. I like working with these little stick figures, and they're almost like a kind of font for storytelling. This is a collection I made for a poster from various cartoons. It's kind of fun figuring out how to make various things work with these very simple tools. The next few of these were done during the pandemic. Coronavirus advice from a Regency novel. Stay home, like a young lady ostracized for unbecoming behavior. Socially distance, like secret lovers under the watchful eye of a malignant aunt. Wash your hands, like a duchess after contact with the boy who feeds the pigs. Wear a mask, like a respectable gentleman on his way to a secret moonlight tryst. And there's the sketchbook page where on one side I was working that out, and on the other side was some stuff which eventually turned into some science cartoons I made. Sometimes I have the general idea, and then it takes a while to figure out what direction to go in. The bookshop cat and the pandemic. The carefree days before. The terrifying early weeks. The long months of lockdown. The triumphant reopening. So there's me trying to figure out how to draw a cat in my sketchbook, which starts off quite awful. Often I redraw things and redraw them until they get less awful. The libraries have reopened, so the librarians must resume their rigorous training regime. Book-laden speed walking. Endurance book recommendation. Blindfolded library navigation. Cross-country book trolley racing. Speed shelving. Storytime toddler herding. Great lost sentences. 1813. Jane Austen writes a sentence so charming and witty that it gets married to the richest man in Staffordshire. 1903. Henry James writes a sentence so long and circuitous that he becomes lost inside it for 3 days. 1947. Raymond Chandler writes a sentence so hard-boiled that it spikes his drink, steals his savings, and frames him for a murder. A survey of the layers in the teetering pile of unread books next to my bed. Base layers. Laid down many years ago and slowly covered by a thick layer of dust, these volumes now perform a purely structural role. Lower layers. These long-forgotten titles will probably be stuck here forever. Their only hope is a catastrophic collapse of the entire pile. Middle layers. Once these books were at the top of the pile, but their chances of being read dwindle as new layers relentlessly accumulate above. Upper layers. A few books wait in the prime position. Some may be picked up and read, but most will be covered by a fresh intake of new books. Some useful abbreviations for the time-pressed online reader. Too long, didn't read. Very short, still didn't read. Should read, probably won't. Read a bit, got bored. Skim read, missed point. Read headline, posted angry comment. The reclusive author tells us about his writing day. I wake at the same time every day, and after a breakfast that I am unwilling to discuss, go to a room that I will not describe and write in a manner that I do not wish to talk about. People often ask me if I use a typewriter, a word processor, or a pen. I never tell them. When I have written a specific number of words, I stop. The way I choose to spend the rest of my day is a private matter. The reclusive author will neither confirm nor deny that an as yet untitled new book may or may not be published at some time in the near or far future. Literary fiction nursery rhymes. Tom, Tom, the piper's son, stole a pig and away did run, but he cannot run from the traumatic relationship with his overbearing father. Hickety-pickety, my black hen, she lays eggs for gentlemen. Then a chance encounter leads her to ask whether there could be more to life. Rub-a-dub-dub, 3 men in a tub, and each in his own way coming to terms with loss, failure, and mortality. I married a memoirist, so I suppose I must accept this unflattering portrait of me. But your description of Marlon as a bad dog is untrue, unkind, and unforgivable. Okay, this is the last one. Based on real events. Bedtime reading routine. 1. Get into bed. 2. Take book from bedside table. 3. Open book at marked page and place in lap. 4. Pick up phone and scroll through social media for 45 minutes. 5. Replace bookmark in book and go to sleep. So that's the end of the reading, and now I think Tom's going to come up and we will have a chat. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Is this on? Is this on, everybody? Yeah, okay. Thanks for coming out. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah. We've really gotten ourselves into a pickle on this tour with that. I've somehow locked up my phone. I want to talk about, I think I didn't realize that you've been doing this strip for 17 years, which I've probably known you for possibly longer than that, so I was kind of shocked a little bit. So I guess you're by now known as, in the UK, as a national treasure for this strip. And I'm kind of curious how you ended up there, where your origins were, like as a cartoonist, and how you got this particular job.
Yeah, well, I didn't start out making short, funny cartoons. I studied illustration at Edinburgh College of Art, and then I sort of felt at the end of that I wanted to spend some more time figuring out what to do. So I came to London, and luckily, on the course I was doing there were other people telling stories with pictures, and I made a good friend called Simon Leah, and we self-published some zines together. And they were jokes, but they were quite long, slow, short story jokes rather than tight cartoon jokes. But I was going around with my illustration portfolio looking for work, and The Guardian were kind enough to hire me to do some illustrations, not cartoons. And then there is an actual national treasure called Posy Simmons, who makes wonderful comics and graphic novels. And she was doing a weekly comic strip called Literary Life, which was at the front of the Review magazine. And they asked me, they said, she's going on a sabbatical for 8 weeks. Would you like to take over from her? Which was amazing and also completely terrifying, because I really was right at the beginning of my career. I wasn't used to making that type of joke, but I couldn't say no, so I sort of went for it, and I had a few weeks to come up with a concept, and I did some stories called The Writer at Work, kind of inspired by my predicament, I suppose, where various famous writers go to their writing desk and for different reasons couldn't write. So they were still in the minimal, understated style of my previous comics, but it was my start doing comics for The Guardian, so I'm very happy that Posy took that break. And that sort of led to them saying, we've got this much smaller space on the letters page, could you make illustrations or cartoons. They can be a bit cartoony if you want. And over time, they gave me a slightly bigger space, and it was easier to do cartoons in there. And I guess I kind of learned on the job how to make funny cartoons. And the first year or so, they're pretty patchy because I'm figuring out what to do. But something about that weekly deadline means I had to do it, and I had to learn on the job, and I was very lucky they did. So when we put together that first book of cartoons, I really had to edit down from the first year. There wasn't much that quite worked.
There wasn't much you kept.
There wasn't much. There was a handful where I managed to make the correct thing, and there were others that were too specific to the text or just really didn't work or were just a pretty illustration. So I'm kind of really grateful with The Guardian for giving me this space to play with while I got better at this.
Uh-huh. And your style was pretty locked in by then, right? Like the kind of minimal style that you use. Yeah.
I mean, that was... I was working with stick figures already. At art school, I wanted to be an illustrator. I didn't believe I'd be able to write stories which were worth reading, so I was thinking I'd illustrate other people's stories. But then I met people who made comics, and they seemed to think of it as a kind of natural thing that anyone could try. So I started. And I should say before that, I'd been flailing around at art school trying to figure out my style, which is a horrible thing that art students are always trying to do. And you can't not do it, but it's tricky. And I made awful work. I was trying to be angsty and passionate and make these dark, sinister works, which, trolled my soul. And they were embarrassing and awful, and I was never happy with them. But then when I started writing comics, I sort of found telling stories such a challenge that I didn't have time to think about the drawings, and I just made them in the simplest way. I think on some level maybe I thought, well, I can make them, I can improve and get into more detail in the drawing, but to start with, I'll just try telling stories with stickmen. And then I found I liked it, and it sort of worked for the sort of stories I wanted to tell. And then when I got the job in The Guardian, as you saw in the picture of the page I'm in, it's not a big space.
Right.
So making simple, small drawings kind of worked. And then, I guess, over the 17 years, I've just got more used to that, and it's kind of affected my style, I suppose, this way of working.
Now, you mentioned just about the style a bit more. You mentioned Edward Gorey as an influence, which I think is obvious to anybody who is familiar with both your works. But there's other little influences that sneak in humor-wise and stuff. Can you
for
speak
sure.
to those?
Yeah. Well, Edward Gorey was a big influence because I found his books in the college library when I was in that beginning to write comics. But what really inspired me about him was the fact that he just did his own thing. He told picture stories for adults, which sometimes used the tools of comics and sometimes didn't. And he just picked and chose, and he didn't make zines. He self-published these elegant little books. And he was just one unique person who followed his own rules. And that kind of gave me the confidence to think, I can write comics with these stickmen rather than using every element of comic storytelling. But in terms of making the weekly funny cartoons, a big influence is Gary Larson's Far Side cartoons, which I just loved as a teenager. They were a huge influence on my sense of humor, almost more than my work.
Do people still know Far Side? Yeah.
I have a theory with Far Side that it was so ahead of its time. It was just absolutely so different from everything else back then. And the world's kind of caught up with it. And that sense of humor is now in the mainstream more. So they don't seem quite as shockingly strange. But
it was kind of the heyday of kind of like the nice family strip. And then there was this weird strip like right next to it. I went through the same thing, probably like everybody did. You were like, this guy, this there's cows making jokes.
Yeah, and it looked different from the others. And I was growing up in the countryside in Aberdeen, but it was printed in our local paper alongside the farming news and all these other things. I suppose that kind of makes sense for the cows. So he was a big influence before I made any comics. And then I guess someone like Roz Chast, who makes the most, I think, some of the best New Yorker cartoons of all time.
And she makes lists a lot of times too. Like you're like, that's a cartoon, but it's really a list of things.
Yeah, no. I've definitely been inspired by that, and her, not following the rules of the New Yorker gag cartoon every time and doing her own thing was definitely an influence. And there's an American cartoonist called Michael Kupperman whose very silly work has made me. One of his books made me laugh so hard that I was crying in bed. My wife just thought I was having a nervous breakdown. So he's another influence who I often forget to mention, but he's great.
Yeah, he really is. And there's a similar kind of graphic styling, like overly stylized, almost.
Yes.
Like not pretending to be real in any way.
Not pretending to be real, but
like really nice designs.
Yeah, and also not trying to look funny, I would say.
Right.
I want my cartoons, nobody's going to think they're not a cartoon, but there is I suppose, a fake dryness or a kind of joke scientific perfection that I'm trying to get there. I'm trying to suggest maybe a buffoon is trying to make something perfect. So there, it's kind of, no one's going to look at them and think, oh, there's a real diagram. But I think hopefully on some level the funniness is a little bit of a surprise, rather than telegraphing the idea that by having a big nose or whatever, that comedy's coming.
I was going to ask about that, how you kind of, those influences are swirling around in your head, but sometimes, we don't draw on them, I guess, and how you came to use so many different approaches. Because it's very much your own thing to be so different, to do a list and then do diagrams. And I can't think of anybody typically doing diagrams for comics, for jokes. And then there'll be, you'll have a multi-panel, sort of more traditional comic strip. And then sometimes a single panel joke.
Yes. Partly, I suppose, I don't have one ongoing story. So each one is its own, in the way The Far Side was, is its own thing. But I enjoy the challenge of making it different every week. So I enjoy it when I come up with a classic New Yorker style one-line, one-image gag cartoon, but I don't come up with those every week, and I'm not sure I'd enjoy coming up with those every week. And the fun is for me to play around, to treat that space as a playground every week, to try new things. And sometimes, I might just think, I'm going to try and fit 25 panels into this tiny little space. And that quite structural idea can lead, what sort of story would I tell in those panels, or whatever.
Was there kind of like an aha moment, like you had a better joke and you realized, I have to do it this way. I have to break tradition of what somebody would do in this space? Or did I'm not sure
I recall when or why I first started doing it. But I've always thought that comics are sort of infographics, and I am a sort of nerd for diagrams and things like that. So I think it was also, I've drawn since I was a kid. It was just what I did all the time. Any friends of my parents who would come and visit, I would just, they all recall my whole childhood was just me lying on the floor drawing while the world went on around me. So I've always been more confident in my ability to draw something nicely, or to use design to make it look good. And the writing jokes and ideas is definitely more recent. So I think there's part of me thinks, that's a pretty good joke, but if I use these skills, which I'm more comfortable with, I can take it that bit further, or make it that bit more unexpected, or I can put it in the form of a diagram where where you don't expect humor to be.
You've talked a bit, I mean, I just know this, we've been in a car with each other every day for hours driving around, but you talked a bit about your parents, and your mom was a teacher and your dad was an architect. And
yes.
That seems sort of, I guess, obvious in a way. Like you described your mother as a professional encourager.
Yes. And my dad, a kind of brilliant sort of stationery cupboard who I could get to bring home paper from work. So I think, it was, I watched my dad being an architect. He had a drawing board, it looked amazing. He had these old architecture pens, which I was never allowed to use because you could bend the nib very easily. And he had a razor blade that he'd scratch off things that went wrong. I wasn't allowed near that. But half the time I'd see him, he'd be doing that, and I thought, that looks like the greatest job in the world. And then I'd be sitting in his Land Rover while he was on a building site shouting at a builder who'd done something wrong. And I thought, I do not want that side of the job. So I guess I took the bits I wanted, the desk and being on your own drawing things, and I got rid of everything else. You know, he had T-squares, he was drawing things in boxes. Yeah. I mean, it's totally Freudian.
I wasn't going to take it that far. So you do 2 strips a week now. It started off doing the one for The Guardian, and it initially was, there was a prompt for you, right? Like you had to draw on the letters that people were writing in and write a joke off of that.
Yeah, that was because I was on the letters page, I had to take the letter as a jumping off point. And as I got better at it, I realized I could go very far from it as long as I had some logic as to how they connected. And once I started realizing, people like these cartoons even if they don't feel like reading the letters, then I took more and more leeway doing my own thing, and everyone was happy with it. But then over time, people wrote fewer and fewer letters to The Guardian, and eventually, they still write to The Guardian, to the editor, but fewer people were writing to the books pages, I guess because they could comment on the website or whatever.
Right.
So they had a redesign, they got rid of that page, and I got to stay on doing the cartoon just about, generally it's about anything I feel like writing about in books, but occasionally the editor gets in touch and says, there's a big new Hilary Mantel book coming out. Maybe you could do something about that. Or it's Super Thursday. There's a day in, is it November, where more books get published than, or maybe it's October, than any other day in the year, so they can sell for Christmas. So something like that, they might request something. But generally, quite a lot of the job now is thinking, what do I want to write a cartoon about? I'm always looking for something. So the last one I showed, very rarely does something happen in my life that inspires a cartoon. It's often a very convoluted process. But that last one, I sort of was in bed. I did exactly what I described there. And as I closed the book and realized what an awful thing I'd done, I thought simultaneously, but this would make a perfect cartoon. So that one almost has the cleanest journey from idea to execution of anything in the book.
Now, so I was getting to, so you start doing a cartoon for The New Scientist, and this is not a collection of those, but so they saw this, they saw your Guardian strip, and they were fans, and they asked you to contribute a strip, or you were doing illustration. What's the story there?
Well, I've kind of had a relationship with New Scientist magazine since I was quite small, because my grandfather was a marine biologist, and he would get that magazine every week, and he'd give it to my dad, and when he was done, and I'd look at them. And it's always very well illustrated, because often they're trying to, describe concepts which are concepts rather than things you necessarily have a photo library for. So they've always been good at using illustration. And because I quite like drawing nerdy things like computers and robots and stuff, they would hire me from time to time. And I think I'd self-published a little collection of some other cartoons I'd done. And I was sending it to a few friends. I probably sent you one. And I sent one to Craig, the art director at New Scientist, with a little note, which I didn't even plan before. I sent it to him because I liked him, and I just scribbled, if you ever want a weekly cartoon, I'd be happy to do one. And he emailed me the next day and said, I've spoken to the editor. He got your book, You're All Just Jealous of My Jetpack, for Christmas, which is my first book of these literary cartoons. He got it from 2 different people, and he loved it. And he says, can you do 12 of them as a pitch? And I was a bit shocked because I really hadn't expected that. And then I panicked a little because I'm a big reader. I like literature, and I felt I was on home turf there. And science, apart from occasionally reading New Scientist magazine and liking science fiction, is not my thing. So
Right,
I went...
Science fiction.
Yeah, and you can't do that every week. It needs to be science fact. So I sort of went on a sort of boot camp of suddenly started following lots of scientists on Twitter and listening to science podcasts and resubscribing to New Scientist magazine and just trying to educate myself. But I was still kind of terrified that the scientists would just be furious at this buffoon misunderstanding their world. But they were really warm and happy, and there's nothing delights me more than when I do a very silly cartoon about geology and someone asks to use it in their lecture. Or I have a good friend who's a scientist, and just last week she tweeted me a picture from a lecture she was at where someone had used one of my cartoons. So they seem to have, maybe like the writers, kind of, they like the fact that I'm making fun of them with love and with care and not, as I said, the cartoons are very silly, but I often think them through quite carefully, and I think people appreciate that.
So you basically have to write 2 joke cartoons a week now, and I'm thinking that must be kind of particularly stressful endeavor. And I'm kind of wondering, are you always like jotting down things and banking jokes, like, oh, I'll save this joke for later, I'll save this cartoon for later? You're on tour right now, so you're working a bit ahead. Do you have like a stack of cartoons that are, set aside waiting to be published?
Well, there's something about the act of making these weekly cartoons which really works for me. I think the fact that I feel in both of these publications, there's this space that I have to fill, and I have to fill it by Tuesday for The Guardian and Wednesday for New Scientist. And something about that oncoming deadline stops me spending forever thinking about these things. And I sort of tell myself, if I don't have a great idea, which does occasionally happen that I have something I think's great, I have to take my least bad idea and polish it as carefully as I can and send that in, because they would rather have a good, averagely good cartoon than an empty space or having to hold the presses, which costs something like £10,000 an hour or something. They get fined. So nobody's happy if you're late. So unfortunately, the deadline, without a deadline, I'm not good. And those 12 cartoons that I did for New Scientist, I thought, well, I'll just work weekly and I'll always be 12 ahead. And then, but that's not how it happened. Within 6 months, I'd fallen back to I'd lost those 12, because when there's no deadline, I just kind of, my brain doesn't, I think I need the fear somehow. So I did a bunch so I could come away here, and that's fine. But it's difficult for me to work ahead. And there's something about the process, the feeling it's a weekly task rather than making a work of art, makes it easier.
After the tour, are you like getting home on a Sunday, and then Monday you're just right back to scratch? You got nothing?
The plan is on the tour I'm going to have some brilliant ideas, because I've got one New Scientist cartoon in my bank, so that's fine. But I do need to come up with a Guardian cartoon the day after I land back. So I'm hoping on this tour I'm going to have a few ideas. I've got a few, the beginning of something which might work. And often that's all I need. And then the focus that comes with the terrifying oncoming of the 5 p.m. deadline means focuses me.
Uh-huh. Now, you've also done a couple of graphic novels. That, like, you have, this is your 4th collection. I don't know. I'm the publisher. But this is your 4th collection, right?
Yeah, this is the third. This is the third literary one, and then there's the science one as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you've done 2 graphic novels for us, and what's that like? Like, just it's a different mindset. It's a different approach, right?
Yes, and for me, it's much harder. I think one of the things that helps me make these cartoons is that feeling of, well, people are paying £3 for The Guardian, and my cartoon is, 1% of the paper, so they're paying like 3 pence for my cartoon. So I don't feel beholden to people, and if they don't like it, they've only paid 3 pence. That's what I tell myself when I hand in a mediocre cartoon. But the feeling with a graphic novel is I'm making this whole book. I want people's attention for half an hour or an hour, and I need to think of a good story to tell. And the thing I love is having a story and figuring out how to tell it with comics. But coming up with that idea is tough. I sort of feel it's a little bit like making a snowman. You start with a tiny little snowball and you have to roll it around, and at first it's tiny and your back's hurting and it's not getting much bigger, but then as the momentum goes, then you're rolling this giant thing which is picking up loads of snow. And unfortunately at the moment, as I've told you, in the early stage with this pathetic little snowball which I can't really tell if is any good or not. And that sort of overthinking is something the weekly deadline stops. But on the other hand, making a graphic novel is such fun. The idea of using all those tools of comics, I can stretch a joke out. I can have as many panels as I want, which I can't do with the smaller cartoons. So all that bigger canvas is such a delightful thing, and the fact you can design the whole book to help tell the story, and it's such a treat to do a graphic novel. And there's so many I look at and just feel, just awed by, that it feels like a worthwhile thing to try for, even if it's much harder for me.
Your graphic novels are kind of like the plot is kind of like, oh, here's a joke. And then you have like jokes within the joke, with the bigger joke, right? And then even some, you get kind of to the heart of things.
Well, I think with all my
hanging
work,
around in that joke world.
Yes. And I think with all my work, I'm sort of bouncing off an existing idea of something. The literary cartoons are bouncing off the world of literature. And my 2 graphic novels, Goliath, plays off the Goliath story. And I like the fact that the audience knows the story, and then my story can intersect with that and move away from it and play with your expectations the way these do.
Right.
And I did a science fiction book called Mooncop, which kind of bounces off all those sci-fi stories that I loved, that I still love. And even my kids' book, which is a sort of fairy tale, is playing with the expectations of a kind of Grimm's fairy tale, and is inspired and almost pastiching, or what's the word I'm looking for? Is a kind of love letter to fairy tales. So there's some part of me likes having that thing to play, that existing thing to play off.
Now with the children's book, it's kind of a little bit of I guess a little bit of a departure, or I don't know. You have kids, and so oftentimes that kind of goes along, like you're doing your own comics, and you think like, oh, it would be nice to have my own book to read to my kids. Like, what's the origin of that kind of, like, how you came to do this kids book?
Well, I'd wanted to do a kids book since I was at art school, and there are so many great kids books that I remember from my childhood, and it's such a wonderful form for illustration. But I never got round to it. And then I had children, and I went through what I think of as a kind of children's story boot camp of kind of 5 years, which I think most parents go through, where you're reading I had 2 children, so 1, 2, or 3 stories a night, and you really learn what's good and what isn't. And when you have to read a story which you hate, but for some reason the children love, it's just painful. Yeah. And I realized how great the good ones are, and it really inspired me. And I thought, I want to find a way to do a kids' book. And simultaneously, I was making up some stories for my children. I had one set of stories I told them on car journeys, which were intentionally soporific and boring to get them to fall asleep, because it's often late at night. We'd drive up to Yorkshire to visit family, and they'd be in the back, and they were intentionally long and soporific and would send them to sleep. But one night in the house, I made up a different story, because my youngest daughter, Iris, we call her the log, because every night she just sleeps totally soundly, and every day has to be woken in the morning. Even now, she's 14, I still have to wake her every morning, or she'd just sleep. So we called her the log. And I came up with this story about, I love Grimm's fairy tales, so I made up this fairy tale about a princess who every night when she falls asleep turns into a log. And the girls liked it. In fact, the first night they told it, they said it was too scary, because I had the log always about to be put on a fire, which I thought, ooh, danger, excitement, tension, but the kind of being burned alive aspect they found a bit frightening. So the next night I came up with a different version, which is basically the same story, but we just never mentioned the possible end result for a log. And they didn't seem to mind that, and no one seems to have minded that. So that was a good first editorial note from my children. But it took me a long time to turn it into a story. And that's why by the time it came out, my daughters were 12 and 14. But over the years, they'd helped. They'd edited it with me and made it better. So it's a lovely family creation.
I realize I haven't been paying attention to the clock, and we've been, that's okay. So we should, does anybody have any questions? Do we have a setup for questions in the back, or?
Yeah, so, oh my gosh, I'm too close to the monitor. So I will take the mic around so people who are watching online can hear, so.
Thanks both for coming. I've been an admirer of your work for a long time. I think I maybe first saw it in the New York Times Sunday magazine. You did a strip for them for a while, I believe.
Yes, yeah, I've done a handful of things for them, yeah.
And I had a question about just in your copyrights, and when you work for these magazines, like are your books largely a collection of, not the graphic novels, of course, but some of the science comics and things? Are they, and the librarians ones, collections of work that you've done for many of these periodicals and The Guardian? And do they have like a work for hire agreement where they own them, or they let you publish them and collect them on your own? Or, yeah, just curious how that works.
Well, in both cases for Guardian and New Scientist, I have a very generous one-time usage contract. So they get to print it once and have it on their website, and then I never hand any rights over to them. I mean, I think in the old days, if you know, a syndicated newspaper strip, you'd be giving away a lot of rights. But I guess because I started out doing illustration for them, it's a kind of standard illustration thing that people get to use something once and that's it. So that's great. They're very supportive of my books and kind about the books, but they're also happy to just let me do my own thing. So that's kind of great for all of us. Less complicated for Tom too.
Yeah, it's true. I don't have to ask anybody anything. No permission. Do we have any more questions? Come on, somebody's got a question.
Excuse me.
How did you end up with Drawn and Quarterly?
Good question. Thank you for offering that. Well, at the time when ever since I was at college, I wanted to make a graphic novel, but as I've talked about, it seemed like a big, difficult prospect. And I was making all these little handmade comics, and I was just reminding Tom that I sent him some of my earliest handmade comics when he had another publisher called High Water Books, who really inspired me. They had a wonderful collection of books and an amazing website which had a kind of, was it every week a different cartoonist doing something?
We had a new cartoon every day.
Every day. Well, and they were great. There was cartoons by Ivan Brunetti that I loved, and loads of other amazing people. And so I sent these mini comics to Tom, and I didn't hear anything. And about a year later, he sent me an email which said, "Your comics fell down the back of a cupboard, but I found them." And this is kind of, I think, sort of classic Tom. Although he tells me he's more effusive with his praise with new authors these days. He said, "Most things I get sent are terrible, and these are quite the opposite," which I thought was a charmingly roundabout way of complimenting me. But I don't think I knew you were Rat, Drawn and Quarterly, but at the time in Britain there weren't many publishers doing comics, and none that really excited me, whereas the work Drawn and Quarterly were publishing did excite me. Because it's a bit weird. I live in London, I'm from Scotland, and a lot of people assume I'm Canadian because they publish me. But they just seemed like the best publisher in the world for what I wanted to do. So when I had my idea for, I think I just wrote to them and said, "I'd love to do a graphic novel for you." I didn't even have a pitch. And you,
Right, and it took forever, I think.
It did. Somebody wrote back and said, "Sure, yes, we'd love to publish it when it's done." And because of the lack of a deadline, I then footered around for probably 5 years, and eventually presented Goliath, and you guys liked it, and it came together. And then I sort of said, "Oh, you probably won't want to publish these Guardian strips because they're humor strips, they're not graphic novels." But Peggy and Tom and Chris said, "Sure, let's do it." And then that's how we've ended up doing these 5 books.
For Goliath, you actually, I remember you sent in the pencils for the graphic novel, which Tom's pencils are perfect. So when he inks them, it's just the ink going on top of those very perfect lines. It's not like some people send really sketchy, rough beginnings, and a lot of people don't send anything. But so he basically sent in the book, and he said, "Just let me know if you want me to change anything, any edits you have." And it was a completed graphic novel, and so we're like, "No, it's fine."
And I thought that meant, this book is so terrible, we can't possibly even improve it. So just finish it, we'll publish it, and then we can all move on with our lives. So
we really have to work on our communication.
That's the madness of the unpublished artist who's trying to make their work, is the paranoia you can get from even the most perfect feedback, which is, "This is wonderful, we'd like to publish it." Somehow you tell yourself, that means they hate it. So it's insane.
I'll try to be better about that.
No, you were better. It was my madness.
Any more questions? Anybody? Okay.
We can get down to signing some books.
Yep, I think so. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you all so much. It's been fun.
And Tom's going to sign right over there.
So Tom is going to be right here. So you can line up this table, and then there's a door right back here that I'm going to open, and you can just go right out there when you're done. Thanks so much.